Hello, I'm Scott Borders, and welcome to another edition of History in Your Own Backyard. Today we find ourselves in Georgetown, Kentucky. In fact, at the Georgetown Scott County Museum, and joining me, Ron Vance, a longtime volunteer here at the museum. Ron, how are you doing today?
Doing fine, thank you.
Now, Ron, do me a favor and tell me a little bit about some of the history just behind this building and the museum itself.
Okay, the museum was created by the Historical Society, and initially it was in a couple of basement rooms out at Cardome. That was a Catholic boarding school here in the county, and that was established first in 1992. In 1998, the county was able to get the post office building here, which had been built in 1915 and had been the post office up until 98 when they built a new post office and moved. And we were allowed to then move into here. We had more space here. We kept as much of the elements of the post office as we could. The lobby is basically intact, except we put a door where the letter drop was so that you could have easier access into the museum. But and we took out some partitions in here, but otherwise it's pretty much the same building.
Now, Ron, one of the interesting things I've seen in the museum is a showcase of what looks like a lot of really shiny silver. Tell us a little bit about that silver.
Well, we have two cases here with silver in it. One of the cases is silver that was made here in Georgetown. There was two brothers named Shepherd, and they had partners a couple times, and the silver that's in that case was all made here in Georgetown. The case next to it is silver that was retailed here in Georgetown, and it's marked by Georgetown Silversmith, but as far as we know, the silver was all bought in Cincinnati and retailed here, and the fellow that owned the jewelry store was basically a fellow that could work silver and repaired jewelry and made some jewelry, but probably never made any of the silver that's in the case here.
Now, tell us a little bit about the tie-ins with the Mexican War here in Georgetown.
Well, we had a fairly large contingent of people that joined the Army to go to Mexico, and we have authentic items from that period in the case here. And the bottom of it is the only piece that really ties to Georgetown history, and that was a sword that was presented to a young fellow who lived out over around Stamping Ground. His name was Benjamin Branham, and he lost his hand in the Battle of Buena Vista. And the county court had presented that sword to him as a commemoration of the fact that he was one of the more serious casualties in addition to the people that lost their lives.
Now, there is an entire area of the museum that's dedicated to some more rotating exhibits. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, we've usually have exhibits in the back room there, usually of 2 or 3 months duration. The current one now is about Beatrix Potter, and we have all kinds of items about her and Peter Rabbit and all of her characters that children are so familiar with now. But previous to this, we have had exhibits of portraits that were done here in Scott County. We have had, well, usually at Christmas time, we'll have a Christmas theme.
Okay, now some of the people a lot of times think one of the major crops is tobacco, but actually before the tobacco, it was hemp. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, from the time of settlement, say from 1820 up until 1880, the hemp was the primary crop. There was some tobacco that was grown, mostly for personal use, small bits, but it was about 1860 when the white burley tobacco was developed up in Ohio, and it was found very soon that Scott County soils and all of central Kentucky was the ideal growing state for burley tobacco. And so even up to today, although there are fewer people growing it, we're still producing about as much tobacco as we did in the early days.
Now, Ron, one of the exhibits I noticed was just what looked like a wheel. It's called a demountable wheel. Tell us a little about how that works.
Yes, the demountable wheel was first patented here in Georgetown in 1914 by a company known as the Prather brothers. In fact, Prather descendants are still living here. But before the wheel was developed, you had to repair your tire on the car. So it made quite a difference when you got to the point where you could take the tire off and repair it. But we always find that very interesting that it was first patented here in Georgetown.
Now, right just down a little ways from that exhibit, there's an exhibit about pencils, because I believe it's the Mallard Pencil Company was one of the big companies here in this area. Tell us about that.
That's right. Elroy Mallard came from Tennessee up here in 1945 and started making plans for a pencil company here, which opened the following year. And they were in operation here for about 30 years. But that was the largest employer here for probably 15 years or so.
As I first walked in to the museum, over to the left, there's a big clock in the corner. Tell me about that.
That was a street clock that was right on the street across from the courthouse and stood there for 30 or 40 years. We don't know exactly when it was taken down, but the museum found it in a basement laying on its side, and so it was given to the museum. And
now, you told me one of your favorite pieces in this museum is a beautiful work of art of a horse, go figure, in Kentucky. Tell us a little bit about that horse and what it meant to this region. Glencoe was the name.
Yes. We have a painting that was done by Edward Troy, who was the foremost horse portrait painter of the 19th century. And Glencoe was one of the most famous sires. And we're so glad to have the painting here because the little history behind it is that Mr. Troy was married to a Scott County girl, and he visited here often and sometimes stayed for significant periods of time. And we had a fellow here, Alexander Keene Richards, who was a wealthy plantation owner and had thoroughbred horses, and he had decided that if he could go to Arabian countries and buy Arabian horses, he could improve the stock of his thoroughbreds. Didn't quite work out that well, and he heard that Glencoe had been retired from stud, and Glencoe was one of the most famous sires in thoroughbred history. And he bought Glencoe as an old horse and brought him here, and Troy happened to be visiting at the time and painted that painting that we have. And the horse died 3 months later. But he was just an absolutely famous horse, and he shows up in the pedigrees of just about every thoroughbred horse running today. And if you check the lineage of the Kentucky Derby contenders, every horse is a descendant of Glencoe, and most of them many times.
Well, I want to thank you once again for joining us on our visit. I'm Scott Borders, and this is Ron Vance to the Georgetown Scott County Museum. And remember, travel slowly, stop often.